Ladies and gentlemen, let's Red Gaming Technical video. We're going to start part 1 of our Xbox One internal components analysis. So we're going to be, of course, doing an analysis on the hardware specifications and the architecture of pretty much all the known components inside Microsoft's Xbox One. Now, I know what you're going to say, but we've spoken about some of the stuff before, and you're right. The difference is we know a hell of a lot more now. And so we're going to be going through pretty much each and every part. I've also written an article on this. This is part 1, because we're going to be going quite in depth, as it turns out, to some of the components. So in this one, we're going to be focused on the Xbox One's APU. We're going to be focused on the Jaguar core, the graphics engine, the Esram, and a couple of other components. Then, next video, we're going to move on to the DDR3 memory. We're going to speak about the Xbox One South Bridge. We're going to discuss the shape audio and much more besides. So we're going to basically sequentially go through the system. Eventually we're going to discuss the Xbox One's operating system. We're going to discuss exactly how all of that works, how it's put together, the benefits, the drawbacks, and much more. So stay with me, friends. So let's begin. So now we know what the Xbox One roughly is like inside. There are a couple of mysteries that we don't fully understand, at least according to Microsoft. This is primarily, but not limited to, the GPU, specifically the GPU's compute functions, and supposedly some of the ways it deals with compute. Microsoft have stated that there are some points that we don't understand yet, and they're keeping under wraps. I'm unsure why. Some people are also stating that it's kind of like a secret source inside the Xbox One. I don't necessarily know whether to agree with it or to disagree with it. I can't say one way or the other because I'm not privy to Microsoft's internal conversations. So I'm going to say that there probably is some stuff that we don't know. I'd guess the same thing about the PlayStation 4 as well, because let's face it, it's pretty early on at the moment. But anyway, let us move on, friends, and discuss the APU. So the APU is, of course, very similar to the actual PlayStation 4. It's utilizing a 28mm technology, and as I said, if you just look at the damn thing and you look the fact it has an AMD Jaguar CPU, the fact it's using the GCN architecture, it looks pretty simple, or similar should I say. Now, there is a model number on this, and it's actually pretty damn lengthy. It's 001DG3001FEG84HR. Now, in case you couldn't understand any of that, what you could do is check the article out. They have got a lot more information here. I'm going to discuss some parts in the article that, I couldn't simply fit into the video simply because of time. It obviously takes a hell of a lot longer to say some stuff than what it just does, just to write it down, simply because of length of video. I don't think many people would want to this is like a 40-minute video. I know some people would before you say it. So let's discuss the beginning part. Right, so the APU inside the Xbox One, by the way, just in case you're curious what APU stands for, it is Accelerated Processing Unit. Now that basically is all in one die solution, and is an amalgamation of the CPU, the GPU, the ESRAM, hardware move engines, and other shiners as well. As I said, it is using a 28nm process, and as it turns out, the Xbox One's APU is actually quite tight simply because of the ESRAM. A lot of the space was taken up by the ESRAM, which is added to the console to make up for the lack of bandwidth provided by the DDR3. As it turns out, however, the Xbox One's APU is actually pretty cool in terms of the running temperature. This is something that Microsoft had definitely learned from in the previous generation. The Xbox 360 was rife with issues, predominantly the red light of death. Now, figures have been mixed with exactly how much Microsoft lost in terms of financially with the Xbox 360's fiasco, but figures range to over $1 billion. Especially when you start to take into account the goodwill of gamers. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine that your Xbox 360 broke, and then you got it repaired, and then your Xbox 360 broke again. I know several people this actually happened to, particularly the early adopters. There were people I know who basically got so pissed off with this whole situation that they traded in their system for the PlayStation 4. On the other hand, There are horses for courses, because I also know other people who got really pissed off with the whole PlayStation Network outage. Do you remember that? Yeah, of course you do, where Sony got pretty much hacked to oblivion, and people did exactly the same thing. They were like, screw Sony, and they moved to Microsoft. So I imagine they probably regained some will there, because obviously the Xbox Live was pretty damn robust in that case. So the APU is pretty damn advanced. It's huge. But it does run pretty cool. In other words, the temperatures are pretty damn manageable. They seem to be pretty stable, which is good, so it doesn't appear that there's going to be overheating issues with the Xbox One, which in my opinion is, well, let's go with the word good. Anyway, let's move on to the Xbox One's CPU, also known as the AMD Jaguar. The CPU inside the Xbox One is what is known as the AMD Jaguar. Now, the Jaguar is a low-power, high-performance x86/64 CPU. Originally, Microsoft were intending the CPU to be running at 1.6 GHz. That was its target speed. Last minute, they managed to increase this clock speed by 150 MHz. So, of course, for those of you who are bad at math, that's a 1.75 GHz now. So that's pretty damn impressive. Now, that's not as high as the Jaguar can technically go to. It can top out at 2 GHz. But, predominantly, that isn't a smart move for consoles. This is simply due to the fact that consoles are a closed environment. They have very limited scope in terms of how much power you can put through them, cooling, various other things, as well as yields. Quite simply put, let's assume that your target is 2 GHz, right? And let's say that you make 100 chips. Well, what could happen is that you might only get 80 of them that can run at 2 GHz. In other words, the silicon was good enough to run at that speed. On the other hand, let's say that your target is 1.6 or 1.75. In that case, you might get, say, 95 chips out of 100. So it's much better, and therefore you're not wasting so much silicon. Therefore, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to manufacture the processor. Pretty simple stuff. As I said as well, this is a low power part. Now this means it's also requiring a lot less wattage to get pretty damn good performance. You'll also notice these type of CPUs are going to be pretty prevalent in other low power devices as well. For example, Palm PCs or whatever. So I did mention that the Xbox One is using an x86/64-bit CPU. Now, the 64-bit is extraordinarily important. Basically, it means that it can address more memory. Otherwise, you're going to be limited to 4 GB or less, which obviously in the case of the Xbox 360 or any modern console is just not enough. You're going to be all over twisting that. And so they have gone with x86/64 hybrid. It's very similar to a desktop CPU. It's easy to program for, which is unlike the PowerPC architecture which was prevalent in the previous generation. The Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were both utilizing PowerPC architectures. The PowerPC inside the PS3 was a little bit more complicated thanks to the way the cell worked, but regardless, it still wasn't as easy or intuitive as the CISC, which is Complex Instruction Set Computing of x86. That's not to say that everything is sunshine, lollipops, and fun. There are some issues with x86 or Complex Instruction Set. Primarily that you're actually giving up some die space that could be used for, say, registers or other performance-enhancing parts of the CPU. The good news is, however, that you're actually able, should I say, to make more clean and efficient and elegant programs. Now, the Xbox 360 and PS4, are both using 8 cores, and each one can handle 1 hardware thread each. So that's 8 hardware threads total. So this is basically done in a two cluster arrangement. So you have two modules, each can handle, or each module has 4 cores inside of it, and then those cores are connected by an interconnect so that each module knows what the other one's doing. Each cluster has 2 megabytes of shared level 2 cache, so total you've got 4 megabytes, and they do indeed support out of order execution, advanced branch prediction, and other shinies. Now, all of those together basically are important because it means that if you're in a situation where a bit of code comes up that maybe the processor wasn't expecting, it's not going to be basically idling on by, waiting for something else. This means it's much more efficient. It doesn't need to worry so much about the way that the program was actually compiled, therefore it doesn't need to rely so much on the compiler. Now I know what you're going to say, well, in a perfect world, well, you know, the compiler should do its job, damn it. Well, yeah, but unfortunately that's not always the case, particularly when you're dealing with things that have multiple branches, for example, AI or physics and so on. It's very difficult to predict sometimes what exactly they're going to do. So, just like the PlayStation 4, 2 of the Xbox One's cores are indeed reserved for the operating system. This means, for those of you who are keeping count, you're going to be enjoying 6 cores for the games. Obviously, Microsoft may change this in the future. They certainly won't increase the amount that are reserved, because they can't do that, because that means the games are going to basically crash. Just for example, let's say you or your buddy Johnny has programmed a game, and that game requires 6 cores, so you've already assigned those functions. Let's just be really silly and say that each core does... Let's just make up a scenario that's really easy to understand, shall we? Let's say that you have created a game, and let's say that all that game is, or let's say you've developed an application, that's probably going to be more accurate. Let's assume that that application is nothing more than a 6-sided cube. Nothing else, just a 6-sided cube. So you've got each direction, up, down, and all 4 sides. Okay, simple. You've allocated each core to each of those sides. So in effect, each side has 1 core attached to it, and that's what computes everything to do with that side's data. So position, what goes on. Maybe, for example, you've got maybe it changes colors. Maybe it changes colors. Maybe if you walk or you shoot that cube, it creates flashing lights. Whatever, just make it up in your head. But the point being that each of those sides is relegated to a CPU core. But let's say that I was to take one of those away. What happens exactly? The cube no longer can exist properly, or one of the sides will disappear, or you'll have to rewrite algorithms and therefore patch an old game. That doesn't really work. So in which case they can't take away resources. Simple as that, because you'll get problems. This is exactly the same issue, by the way, as say memory. So you can't have a certain percent of memory. Let's say, for example, the Xbox One has 8 gigs, but let's just make an arbitrary figure up and say that 4 gigs is usable by games. It's actually more than that, but I'm just trying to give you guys an easy to think of number. Well, what would happen? Let's say that I give you 4 gigs, and then you create your game, and then I say to you a week later, by the way, bro, actually I've kind of changed my mind. You're actually going to get, 3.8 gigs. So you're short 200 megabytes now, right? Well, you've already used that memory. You've already grown accustomed to it. You've bought it a ring. You've dated it for a while. Your application really likes it. Yeah, too bad. It's no longer there. So what happens is that if you can't patch it, it will crash, because basically the game is trying to access memory that it's not permitted to access anymore. So therefore, whenever someone says that these things can change over time, if the console's already been released, they can't reduce the allocation, because it would basically be havoc. So they can reduce the amount, for example, of performance that's allocated to say connect, but they can't increase it because of these issues. So hopefully that's clarified some thoughts that some people have had. Regardless, moving on. As I said, the system does support 4 megabytes of level 2 cache. It also has 32 KB of instruction and 32 KB of data cache. These are sometimes referred to as iCache and Dcache, respectively. So the Xbox One puts out about 112 G flops. I'll say that again, G flops of computing power with the AMD Jaguar. So the Jaguar inside the Xbox One puts out 112 G flops of computing power. So that's about 10 G flops more than the PlayStation 4, simply because it's sporting a slightly higher clock speed. At least we think. Sony haven't confirmed the clock speed of the PS4 as of yet. The Xbox One also is using the Jaguar, which in itself is an evolution of what is known as the Bobcat architecture, once again from AMD. So over the Bobcat architecture, you've got things such as about 15% higher performance increase on a given clock. So that's an increase on the instructions per clock. It also supports things such as Intel's SSE 4.1 and 4.2, MOVE-B, AVX, as well as other instruction sets. Let us move on swiftly, my good friend, and let us now speak about the Xbox One's GPU. The GPU inside the Xbox One is indeed the AMD Radeon GCN, also known as Graphics Core Next architecture. Once again, just like the CPU, this is featured on the GPU, it's part of the GPU, and there's actually 14 CUs, compute units, inside the APU, but 2 are disabled due to yields. In other words, let's assume, for example, that they have 14 in there, one of them doesn't work, therefore 13 total, but even so, only 12 are going to be enabled due to yield. So it doesn't matter whether your one had 2 not working simply because the process of manufacturing damaged them, or because you had 14 available. 14 on your Xbox One could technically be okay to work, but they'll basically disable them at the factory. So Microsoft, when they first went into the system, they weren't even enabled. It would basically been disabled on the APU. So nothing to worry about there. So this is basically for fault tolerance. Each CU has 64 shaders. So when you're talking about the Xbox One and you hear it say something like, oh, okay, you've got 764 shaders in the system, that's how they come up with that number. So it'll be 12 CUs times 64 equals 768. That GPU, by the way, is running at 853 megahertz. Now, you can actually do the math on this yourselves, and you can actually take 853, which is the megahertz it's running at, times it by the 768, and then you have to times that by 2, and that will give you the T-flops that the GPU is running. Why times 2? Because as it turns out, the GCN architecture does 2 instructions per clock. I'm simplifying it, but that's the easiest way to explain it. That's exactly the same for the PlayStation 4 as well. So use that exact same number. The difference is you'll times it by 1152 because the PS4 has more shaders. So just to reiterate, you can see the math, by the way, on the website, but I'll just say it one more time so you can check it out on the article. You take 768, you times it by the clock speed the GPU is running, and then you times that by 2. I am writing a program that is going to do a lot of this for you, including working out the memory bandwidth and stuff. I am working on it. It's just I've had so much other stuff to do with frame rate analysis, the PlayStation 4's launch, website, moving, and God knows what else. So I've been a little bit behind, but I am still working on it. So anyway, that gives you how that works. So the Xbox One also features 16 ROPs. ROPs, by the way, are responsible for the final rendering of a scene. They'll also deal with things such as anti-aliasing and much more. They are really tied in with the system's fill rate. Now, it's worth noting the PS4 has double the amount of ROPS, but in theory, the Xbox One's GPU should be able to handle 1080p at 60 frames per second, in theory. But your mileage, or the game's mileage, or should I say the game's developer's mileage, may vary. It also sports 48 texture units. I think texture units are pretty self-explanatory. They are, of course, responsible for adding textures to polygons and basically to vertices or whatever they're constructing things from. So basically from basic 3D shapes, such as a wall, it will, well, add a texture to it. Pretty simple. Simplified a little bit, but just to give you guys an idea. Just to give you a comparison, the PS4 has 72 texture units. 72 texture units compared to 48. The PS4's 32 ROPS, by the way. Most modern day GPUs for the PC have significantly more as well. As for texture units, same thing for PC. Most high-end PCs for the GPU do actually have more texture units. The Xbox One features 2 ACE, which is asynchronous compute engines. Each handles 2 queues, which means you have 16 total. The PS4 can handle 64 total. That's because it actually has 8 ACEs, each handling, 8 queues. So, yeah, 64. This basically, ACEs pretty much are the engines which allocate when and how a compute instruction is issued to a shader to run. So let's assume that, let's just make this up and say that let's say you're cooking an egg on a cooker, obviously, and you're frying it, and someone gives you, a maths test, and they say to you, okay, I need you to tell me the 4 times table. While your brain's processing both things, so in other words, your brain is multitasking while also trying to cook this egg, right? Same principle here. Basically, the GPU is thinking about multiple things. Now, what happens in reality is that the GPU will basically be told by the CPU that it needs to process things. It will then basically store those commands that it has to run on the ACEs, and then when the GPU has a spare moment, in other words, a part of a scene where it's not as complicated, it has a second to run a compute command, it will then do that. The PS4's is a little bit more advanced than the Xbox One's. In actuality, Sony apparently sparked some interest from AMD, and they've actually taken some of that ideas on board. So the Xbox One, however, of course, does have a very heavy reliance upon the cloud computing system, so we're going to have to see how that actually works. At the moment, it is looking fairly impressive with the games that it is running on, but there you go. So hopefully that gives you a rough idea. I have wrote that down, as I said, in the article, so if you do need that as kind of visualization, you can check that out. The GPU, by the way, is based, as I said, on the Radeon GCN architecture, and that's featured in many desktop GPUs. It was basically started in the Radeon 7000 series, and it's a version of that same architecture is being used on, say, the R9 290, although it's an evolved version. It's not the same one that's inside the Xbox One. It's worth noting that, yes, the T-flops count is not as high as a high-end desktop GPU, but it has a quite advanced API, and it also, just like the desktop version, is using an entirely new instruction set. It's not using VLIW, which is very long instruction word. Next, we're going to talk about the ESRAM. So this is going to be quick and flying. The ESRAM is basically pretty huge to speak about. It has many potential issues, and I've linked a couple of them in the article with this. I've also spoken about the ESRAM quite heavily recently. Basically, the ESRAM is situated on the APU, and it's there to try and make up for the DDR3's memory bandwidth, which, by the way, is 68 gigabytes per second. The ESRAM has a maximum throughput of about 204, but actual is about 150. That's not really a problem, however. Developers are stating that there's more than enough bandwidth inside the Xbox One's ESRAM Not really surprising. It's not that there's not really enough memory though. From what we're understanding, Microsoft are keen to push tiled resources, which is basically a memory resident texturing technique. In other words, it can use virtual texturing from a massive pool of memory. I have spoken about this before, so you can just search for it on the channel if you want a lot more information than what I can possibly give you in this video. But the problem is 1080p, particularly if you're doing it at 60 frames per second, takes a lot of memory on the frame buffer. Therefore, there can be some issues. Apparently, you can texture from DDR3, so what some developers are maybe doing is texturing from DDR3 after the object has already been textured. So in other words, they do the texturing, create the texture, build the texture, and so on the Esram, and they do the rest of it from DDR3, which can be a bit of an issue. Supposedly, if you listen to rumors, this is going to improve over time, but in terms of the developers' understanding of it, but I guess we're just going to have to see because it's pretty early on in the development of both systems yet. Finally, I'd like to point out that there was another theory that the Xbox One could maybe have used a daughter die. That basically means it would have been a die which would have not exactly been part of the original APU package. That, my friends, would have been for the purposes of actually increasing the amount of memory. So it would have used a different type of embedded RAM. They could have put on, say, 128 megabytes, but they didn't decide to do that. The leading theories behind this were cost. It would have cost them more. Therefore, they decided last minute not to do that for whatever reason. Anyway, that's a whirlwind tour of the Xbox One's basic APU and structure. Next video, we're going to be discussing other parts such as the South Bridge and everything else. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.